But first, we're here with data science expert Bill Howe from the University of Washington. First of all, is it too late to do anything about data that might have been scraped by Cambridge Analytica?
Yes, it's perhaps too late to do that, but more importantly, it's a pervasive problem that's not just concentrated in this particular instance with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica is certainly not the only company that's using questionable means to gather data, and Facebook is not the only company that's not doing enough to prevent these kind of bait and switch tactics where you get data under one pretense and then use it for another purpose.
Boy, so who's next?
So I think what's really happening here is that Facebook's being held up as a stand-in for the entire industry, and so with the regulations that, as Mark Zuckerberg said in the testimony, is somewhat inevitable. These regulations are going to affect the industry wide. So it's not so much about who will have a breach next, but really about how the entire industry will respond to these needs. And the European law that was passed, the General Data Protection Regulation, is seen as a bit of a guidepost for what's probably going to have to happen worldwide.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that European model? Because he mentioned it yesterday before the Senate as well. Yeah, so
it's very broad and it's very deep. It covers control. So users need to have control over when and how their data is being used, both before, during, and after the fact. But it also has regulations around the kinds of uses how that data can be used. And so, one point that Zuckerberg made that is perhaps is a difficulty in this sense is that very large companies are somewhat equipped to pay the cost of complying with these rules, but smaller companies will have a harder time with it. And so there's a bit of a shift that's going to happen in the industry to try to how to respond to these new regulations.
Is there a set of ethics that companies sort of have to comply by when they think about data and how they use it?
So it's a fantastic question. I think one thing that, my faculty position here is at the Information School at the University of Washington. One thing we think about pretty hard is how to train the next generation of students so that they think about these kinds of issues as a first-class design consideration as opposed to an afterthought that's somebody else's problem. So I think the the previous generation of engineers are really thinking about the accuracy of their algorithms and the performance of their algorithms, and it's somebody else's problem to worry about how it's being used. And that's starting to shift, though. There's been a real generational shift, in part because of some of these high-profile incidents where we realize the students need to be thinking about this as part of their craft.
What will we be seeing in the near future, and then perhaps further out, but in the near future, what kind of changes will Facebook and other companies be doing now?
So I think they'll be looking closely at what the GDPR says and figuring out what components of that they're able to implement quickly and cheaply. I think the other aspect is that, in this particular instance, one of the things that I like to point out is that the major breach of, major ethical violation was really the fact that the data was gathered under the pretense of academic research and then was used for this other political purpose that was more of a profit motive purpose. And that bait and switch is really the major ethical failing, I think, in this case. There were some bad policies that Facebook has since changed about, if you access my data, you also have access to all my friends' data, and they didn't opt into that. They'll slowly kind of continue to improve on those policies. But how do we prevent that kind of duplicity in how you get data, I think, is really important. And one of the things that I worry about as a researcher is that, these kind of incidents make it harder for people to do valid research who are not selling the data to their third parties. And so I think some sort of response by the companies to differentiate between the people who are trying to make money on this stuff versus the people who are trying to answer some of the fundamental questions, including the questions about how best to protect privacy, needs to be made as well.
Seems like there might be a need for a public education aspect too. Where are young people, for example, supposed to learn all this good stuff?
I think it's a great point. I think, right now, sort of mentioned that it's not just Facebook, it's not just Cambridge Analytica, there's companies all over the map. Everything you do online is essentially being tracked and built into a profile. This is what it is, right? We're in that state. But the troubling thing there is how frequent it is that people don't necessarily understand that that's what's happening. And so this public education aspect, I think, is crucially important. That we can decide what we want to do about it, but first we need to make sure that people are aware that it's even happening, and we're definitely not quite there yet.
All right. Bill Howe, University of Washington, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.